Okay, final stretch. You're almost done with me. So, what I want to do this week is obviously finish the agriculture lecture. And then I'm supposed to cover both manufacturing and services. But there's a lot of material in the textbook, so I will put more emphasis on manufacturing and the service industry. But again, I will add material that will be specific to this class only, that is not in the textbook or in the other mandatory readings. You can expect questions based on those, and I'll let you know when you've got to be extra attentive. Okay, so last week I sort of veered off the book a bit. The authors or supporters of local food, or at least are not critical enough in my opinion, and so I introduced my own historical perspective on the issue. Again, you don't have to agree with me. You might think I'm completely wrong about this. But when you have a question that is of the type, well, according to your professor, you might think your professor is a nut job, but I don't think it's unreasonable of me to summarize the points that I made in class. If nothing else, it's a different perspective on the topic than the one that is in the textbook. And by showing up in class, you have an advantage over your colleagues anyway. So, I was trying to explain to you last week why all agriculture, which before the advent of modern transportation was mostly local, became increasingly globalized. But food is a subject that is very emotional. Obviously, we cannot live without it. It's not like an iPad or textile or some toys. And so because people are so worried about food shortages, and again, remember that it's only the last few generations that for the first time in human history, people in advanced economies have too much to eat and don't even fathom of the notion that we might experience a shortage of food. Because food is something that we're so intimately connected with, and because farmers historically were such an important electoral force, governments have been intervening in agricultural markets in significant ways beyond just protecting local producers through tariffs for almost a century now. And so you've got productions in advanced economies that are either heavily protected or else highly subsidized. Now, some of these are not. So if you look, for example, at the United States or Canada, dairy and poultry, for example, dairy and poultry productions are heavily regulated by the government. They prevent people from entering the market. They protect them from foreign competitors. But as far as produce is concerned, fruits and vegetables, we don't have the same type of support and agricultural protections. Now, this is not to say that they don't benefit from other governmental policies. So, for example, if you ever received corn or cotton subsidies in the United States, you're not allowed to compete, to switch your land over to go compete with the fruits and vegetable producers. So there are indirect protections, but the fact is that governments have been intervening in food markets for a very long time, but they do so in various ways. Now, the authors go over this very quickly. Farmers obviously have an interest in that. A lot of people, especially if they've never worked in the countryside, tend to idealize food production a bit. But by and large, most people want to support their local farmers. We feel a connection with them, and even though we don't really, have nightmares at night about, running out of food, most of us like the notion that there might be food production not too far from our house in case things ever go wrong. But there have been a number of problems associated with that. So one, for example, you ensure that eggs and milk and dairy, butter, cheese products are more expensive than they would be without government intervention. Farmers benefit, but the people who suffer the most are obviously people of lesser income, because dairy products is not something that you can just get rid of in your diet and go consume plastics instead or some other stuff. Okay, there's also the issue of traditional and modern agricultural production and the environment. Now, the authors mention a number of issues that are close to the heart of many people today, so carbon footprints, monocultures. Uh, but again, the point you should keep in mind is that for all its flaws, modern agriculture produces a lot more food on a lot less land. So yes, you require more inputs. You should look at fertilizers, for example, as food for children or just food for humans. You want to have many children, well, you need to feed them. You want to produce a lot of food, where obviously you need to feed it, and the food of food is fertilizers. And the advantage, though, of modern agriculture compared to traditional agriculture is that you get a lot more food on the same plot of land than using less, than when using more traditional methods. So yes, there are more inputs, there might be a bigger footprint, but on the other hand, you use less land and less water to begin with. So there are trade-offs. I mean, both systems are problematic in some ways. I mean, obviously we cannot produce a lot of food without having an impact on the environment, but there are trade-offs in terms of both systems. And in my opinion, for what it's worth, the authors perhaps should have written a few more paragraphs on these issues. Okay, sustainable agriculture, they say, refers to organic agriculture. Again, I have a whole lecture on that on my food policy course. I don't want to get into too much detail here. Let's just say that if you remember what I told you last week about the traditional local food system in Paris in the 19th century, it might look local, but ultimately it was powered by animal feed that came from sometimes even the United States. And so you would ship a lot of horse food to Paris. You had a lot of horses before the car came along, and the whole system was powered by horse manure. So you could view it as local, but ultimately the system rested on distant imports of animal feed. And in a way, local sustainable agriculture is the same way, because a lot of organic farmers, for example, will depend on dairy cow manure for their production. Well, these dairy cows are often fed genetically modified soybeans and corn, for example, and these often also come from some distances. So you might say, well, you know, the local organic system is sustainable because it uses this or that, but again, you've got to go back, you've got to peel the onion and realize that often these quote-unquote local organic systems do depend on distant food import, in that case again fed to cows, and a lot of these would not be acceptable to organic farmers. So again, there are trade-offs. Reality comes in various shades of gray, and there are pros and cons to both modern and quote-unquote organic agriculture. In terms of organization, what has happened in the last century and a half is that farming, or at least conventional farming, has gone through the same type of evolution that you've seen in any other industry. So the number of producers has shrank tremendously, and the size of the operations of each producers have increased dramatically. So farms today, conventional ones anyway, are much larger than they were in the past. And that's because most people got out of farming, and the most productive, or at least the people who wanted to stay in farming, often ended up buying their neighbors and growing their operations. When you're a modern farmer, you're essentially a price taker, and what that means is that if you produce corn, you must produce corn of a certain variety, of a certain quality. If you produce milk, you must meet certain standards. Because you produce commodities or undifferentiated products, what you produce must be the same as your neighbors and everyone else who produce, let's say, I don't know, red winter wheat number 2, if that's still around. Well, then you must produce this stuff and meet a certain quality threshold. So in that context, you're price takers, you're not price makers. It's not like you have, your own little cheese factory, and you produce a product that really stands out from the competition. Okay. The others point out that agricultural markets remain primarily domestic. This is true to the extent that a lot of the stuff that we consume is fresh, and again, shipping fresh food makes sense over long distances at certain times of the year. So for example, our winter is the summer in the southern hemisphere. So while most apples that are still produced in North America will be consumed fresh in September, October, or November, it makes sense if you want fresh apple in March or April to import them from, let's say, Chile, Argentina, or New Zealand, because it is their harvest season. So seasons are inverted in the southern hemisphere. But obviously, if you go to Australia or New Zealand at certain times of the year, you will consume stuff that is produced in the northern hemisphere. So don't be surprised if you ever go to New Zealand, which was for a long time the world's largest kiwi producer, and at certain times of the year you will see that people consume Italian kiwis. And it's not because people like to ship stuff for no good reason, it's because the things come on the market at different times of the year, and the trade-off is between storing fresh local food in refrigerated conditions for several months, which has a heavy energy footprint and costs a lot of money, or else shipping fresh food on a container ship and having it consumed within a short period of time on other parts of the earth. So again, there is an increasing level of trade between countries, and obviously trade occurs when you've got better growing conditions in some part of the world than in others. So if you live in Hong Kong or Singapore, these are obviously not very suitable areas for wheat production or for, I mean, the best you can hope for in those areas are some gardens and, islands around Hong Kong or nearby Singapore. But in terms of grain production, land is just too valuable there to be devoted to something like that. So it makes sense to trade food over long distances. But things that can be stored easily, like wheat or grain, don't tend to travel all that much. The same is true for the type of meat that requires a short time to grow. So some countries do export chicken to other countries, but whenever you have enough room and enough feed, it might make sense to import the feed, but shipping chicken meat is more complex. So it makes more sense to ship soybean and corn, for example, to feed chickens locally than to produce chickens locally and ship the meat over long distances. Now, this being said, if you ever look at the food that you see in a European supermarket, they come from all over Western and Eastern Europe. In North America, you find Canadian products in the United States, American products in Canada, and the same is true in Asia. You find New Zealand dairy products, for example, in many Asian countries. Okay. So I was trying basically to summarize that figure here. So again, agricultural markets are very complex, and if you have any interest, I teach a whole course on that. It doesn't make sense to try to talk about this in 5 minutes. Okay, there might be a question on the vertical and horizontal production. In terms of vertical production, you've got farming operations that are largely independent, that obtain a small share of the value added. But what you've seen over time is the emergence of integrators. So again, the value chain or the supply chain in farming has become more complex over time. It used to be you were an independent farmer, you would raise your chicken, you would go to the city market and sell your chicken. But what you have today, as with, again, any other modern industry, is not so different than, let's say, Nike placing out orders to its suppliers across the world. So what you've seen, although this is still mostly a national or at least continental phenomenon, is that you've got large producers that emerged. They were often farmers themselves to begin with, but they became bigger players in, let's say, the production of turkey meat or poultry or something like that. And so what they've done is that just like Nike organizes its supply chain, those integrators do organize animal production, for example. And so in terms of growing chickens today, what often happens is that you don't have one farm that grows the chicken, from the moment the egg is produced to delivering the chicken to the market. You've got people who specialize in making sure that the eggs hatch, and then they might keep little chicks for a few days. Then they ship that to somebody else who brings the chicken to a certain size. Then that will be shipped to another farmer who specializes to another growth cycle. until the animals are ready for slaughter. So the system again is much more complex than most people realize, and is at the same time fairly similar to what you see in other industries. Now, in terms of horizontal, it combines several inputs and processes. It produces several products. So you've got essentially large firms that operate across different markets. They might have developed some expertise in handling animal feed, for example, but once you produce animal feed, well, you can feed, dairy cows, you can feed beef cattle, you can feed turkey, you can feed something else. But you know what, that's a lot of information, so I think I'll just keep those things for my food course. That's probably too much in the context of this one. Monsanto Cargill cluster. So again, you've got large firms in the United States that were once small, that emerged, developed some expertise, and that again play an important role in supply chain. So even though they might not own all the components, they're essentially the ones coordinating the production. Okay, there's always been obviously a lot of recycling in agricultural production. So if you had animals, you would obviously recycle the manure as a fertilizer in the field. If you produce wheat and you were only selling the seeds, well, you could recycle the rest and turn it again into a fertilizer, into animal feed or something else. Now, one of the co-authors has some fascination with recycling sewage sludge. Again, I told them when I reviewed their book, guys, the idea has been around for at least 150 years, and it never takes off because there's all sorts of really bad things in sewage sludge, metals and all sorts of other things that you don't want to spray on a field for food production. But anyway, the idea has been around, like I said, for several generations, and it never dies, but I don't see that happening anytime soon for, again, good practical reasons. Okay, the advantages of integration. Well, we've mentioned before several times the concepts of internal economies of scale and scope. I'll again revisit that in the context of manufacturing, so forget it here. There's also some advantages in terms of developing a brand, in terms of having larger operations that have the resources to invest in research and development. Another advantage of integration is that small farmers who want to begin a new operation can obtain financing if they become part of an integrated supply chain. It's much easier to get financing if you have guaranteed contracts than if you want to strike it on your own. So if you want to start a small local or regional organic farming, getting financing is obviously more difficult than if you're going to become part of a more integrated supply chain. Standardization of food products. Well, the rise of large corporations like McDonald's has obviously established standards. So the idea of a brand like McDonald's is that wherever you eat your Big Mac, you basically have the same experience. So the meat must be of a certain quality, the bun must be of a certain quality, so the tomatoes, the taste of the ketchup must be the same. So these things do matter, and they tend to introduce innovations in terms of quality in the food supply chain. Say what you will about McDonald's, but they're largely credited for improving the agricultural supply chain in Russia. So when they opened their first McDonald's in Moscow in the Soviet Union, before the Berlin Wall fell, they insisted on quality food, which was not something that you saw a lot of in Moscow in those days. But they established standards that were copied by other people. And it's hard to argue with the notion that McDonald's in what is now Russia did not contribute to improving the quality of the food there. Okay, Engel's law. So this is not Engels of Marx and Engels, but it's too good not to quiz you on that. So Engel's law in this most basic formulation is the notion that as people become wealthier, they spend less of their money on food. So when you're very poor, you obviously spend your money on your most basic needs. So feeding yourself, clothing yourself, making sure that there is heat in your apartment. But as you become wealthier, then you spend more on, hobbies, watching movies, buying extra clothing, what have you. And so the percentage of your income that goes towards food purchases declines, even though the quality of the food might improve, and you might consume more alcohol, or you might consume fancier meat, or just meat, which is something that you were not doing before. But still, the overall percentage that you spend on food tends to decline the wealthier you become. Now, if you're in the business of producing food and you don't have any say over the market, if you're in the business of producing red winter wheat number 2, you cannot improve the quality of your product. You're expected to produce something, but what you can do is improve the quality of the way you produce your product. And so you try to squeeze more red wheat out of your input. So there is an incentive to increase your productivity, but you don't control the price of your final good, and you don't control what you sell. You know, if you're in the business of producing a certain thing, you can improve on the production side of things, but you cannot really improve with your final products. Operations are more capital intensive to increase yields, but they also have cost. Corollary of that is that the type of farming that is likely to go on in advanced economies where labor costs are expensive are the kind of productions that you can mechanize. We import a lot of Mexican workers in Canada to do the job that Canadians don't want to do anymore. There's some good things and there's some bad things about that, but in the long run, it seems fair to say that productions that can be mechanized, where you need less and less people, are more likely to be competitive as agricultural markets open, and you can import food from countries where people are still willing to work in agriculture. Okay, so Engel's law, again, the wealthier you are, the less percentage of your income goes toward food, even though you will eat fancier and more expensive stuff. Contracting, cooperatives, and marketing board. Now, obviously, a lot of farms are still family-owned. Some of these can be big these days. There used to be jokes that in Australia, for example, you could have cattle ranches that were as big as the country of Belgium, for example. But historically, what small farmers who wanted to retain some independence, but at the same time generate economies of scale, did was to engage in relational contracts with other farmers in order to create producers' cooperatives. And so when you belong to a co-op, well, you don't buy your seeds yourself. The co-op will buy it for you, and you will get a discount based on the volume that you have. At the same time, if you want to market your product, well, your co-op might market your milk or might market your grain, because by, again, pooling resources together, farmers who remain independent are nonetheless able to generate economies of scales, both in terms of production and distribution. Okay, marketing boards, I hope they go, that's all I'll say. We have very few of them left. Farm size and rural trends. Again, I grew up in a town of 800 people. Like most people my age, I couldn't wait to get out of the place. Cities, and by that I include suburbs, do offer more opportunities than small towns. And while you have people who like to stay in farming, and again, will grow the operations of their parents and by their neighbors, and again, I could give you names from my youth of a long time ago, the trend has been unmistakable. As soon as economies develop, you see the emergence of cities, as I was telling you before, and the pull of cities towards rural, in terms of attracting rural migrants, has always been very significant. So all advanced economies now are at least urbanized to about, 85% of their population, but you see the same trend emerging in places like China and India. So when an economy develops, a few cities emerge, and most people will leave the countryside and move to cities. But again, the corollary with that is that the people who stay in the countryside are often people who want to be there and who are good at farming, and so they will grow their operations and become more efficient. The problem, of course, is that if you live in a rural community and everybody leaves, well, you might not care about the post office so much today, but it's hard to keep a school going, for example, if you don't have enough kids in a village to sustain it. Geographical implications, been over that. Okay, rise of the green belt. Okay, again, the green belt is a very controversial issue. All I will say on this is that if you love the green belt, you should pay for it. And what I mean by that is that if the kids who grow up on a farm in an area that becomes a green belt would like to sell the farm to someone who wants to build, bungalows or a golf course, they should have the right to do so. And if you won't allow them to do that, then I believe that they should be compensated for the value that they could get on an open market. The problem I have with green belts is that if the government comes along and says, well, you're not allowed to sell your land, even though you don't want to live there, even though you don't want to farm anymore, but we're not going to compensate you for that. And this honestly is an issue that I have a problem with. But anyway, a lot of people like green belts. They're an easy sell to people who live in cities, to the extent that they like the notion that there is this greenery not too far from us, and it's nice when we drive to our cottage or something to see farmland. But again, if we want something like that, I think as a collectivity we should really pay for it, and by paying for it I mean compensating the farmer's kid who don't want to stay there and who would like to sell the farm. Just telling them that they're not allowed to develop it, I believe, is unfair. But that's me. Okay, conclusion. Basic challenge for agriculture is to deliver perishable products to distant market. Many advances were made in that respect in the last century. So containers, refrigerated containers, refrigeration, freezing technology. The modern logistics industry is a wonder to behold if you look at it a bit closely. Primary producers. Well, if you ever meet a farmer who tells you something, I got just enough rain last year, prices are good, life is great, please introduce him or her to me. I haven't met many of those in my life. It's true that they have a tough life, but at the same time, you must be able to make a farm financially sustainable. And the point is that, yes, you might have bad years, and you might say, well, I'm losing money this year, but the point is that farming is cyclical in terms of its price, so you might have a number of good years, a few bad years. If your business model makes sense, you will remain in that line of work, you'll be able to make a go at it. If you're not able to keep your farm going, then you should consider switching production or doing something else. And if it's a hobby, then it's a hobby, but it's not something that is a means of earning a living. Okay. But again, if you want to hear me rant about farming for a whole semester, I have a course on that issue. Okay, so manufacturing and services. Again, 2 chapters, a lot of material. I obviously will not cover everything, it just wouldn't make sense. And I will put some extra emphasis on one industry in order to convey a number of notions that we discussed in the first half of the course, and a few others that are introduced in that chapter. Now, manufacturing is in essence the art of taking raw materials, lumber, iron ore, bauxite, which is the key to make aluminum, and to turn that into complex products that people are willing to buy. Now, manufacturing is a big umbrella term. You can distinguish between primary manufacturing, which uses raw materials or commodities. So if you're a flour producer, for example, you buy wheat and you turn it into flour, and while making flour, some part of the wheat might become animal feed or something else. Or else you might be a secondary manufacturer. So let's say you buy metal sheets and you turn them into furniture or something else. In that case, you use already manufactured inputs and components. Now, of course, some firms are a combination of these activities, and some are, again, extremely complex and do a wide range of manufacturing activities. So in the book, for example, they discuss the main North American operations of Toyota. They obviously don't discuss retails, meaning where you buy Toyota cars or trucks, but they tell you about various assembly plants. So you've got one in British Columbia, you've got operations in Ontario, so research and engineering. You've got you've got assembly operations in California, component manufacturers in California, and so on and so forth. So by and large, even though there were always manufacturing activities, historically they were typically few and far between, and they were often artisanal, meaning that a few people would produce everything from amphoras to textile to weapons to dishes or what have you. But the system of mass production that we think of when we think of manufacturing really began to emerge in the last 2 centuries. First in Western Europe and North America, then in countries like Japan, and obviously more recently in places like China. Now, throughout the last 2 centuries, Germany was probably the country whose manufacturing activities were viewed as the most advanced, or at least produced the best quality stuff. The Americans would produce a lot of stuff. Some of it was of good quality, other was of less value-added things. Japan emerged. Japanese products were viewed as being very bad until maybe the end of the Second World War. Then they really improved their game and began producing a lot of consumer electronics, cars, and sort of took the world over. And then eventually China opened up and became the main assembly plant of the world. Now, in the textbook, they discuss the car industry because, especially for people of a certain age, you think of manufacturing, you think of cars. Now, I know that apparently for people of your generations, although you're from Mississauga, maybe things are different. A car is not as important a status symbol as it once was, but again, you want to convey some notions about manufacturing, you typically deal with the car industry, so this is obviously what I'm going to do. So, what the authors describe is a switch from mass production, and I'll show you a couple of videos on that, towards a more flexible way of producing things. Now, I'm not quite sure if I should quiz you on that, because that's a lot of information here that's not so visually appealing. So make a quick note on figure 11.1. Chances are I won't ask you to reproduce it, but people who write about manufacturing like to discuss this sort of big divide between, well, there was this big factory where everything was assembled and you basically brought the iron ore and you'd get the car at the end, versus assembly activities that involved a bunch of firms and network. My take, for what it's worth, is that historically, most firms were kind of in between these two extremes, but people who write textbook like to come up with this sort of clear-cut opposition. I'm not so much a fan of it. But anyway, the point is that a lot of countries are manufacturing a lot of goods. What people don't realize is that the value of manufacturing by countries keeps going up, even in advanced economies, even though less people are working in manufacturing than in the past. So you often hear people say, well, manufacturing activities have been declining in Canada, the United States, they're only rising in China and what have you. Yes and no. What has been happening is that less people are working in the manufacturing industries, but the manufacturing industries produce more stuff than before because they have more robots. And they have more technologies doing the work of people. So while the number of people employed in the manufacturing sector has been going down, the value created by the manufacturing industries, even in a place like the United States, has been going up, and often significantly. But again, more value is not translated by more jobs, which might explain American politics to some extent. Car production, well, I'll show you a few videos instead. So, a few asides, I mentioned that as often as I can because people today don't realize how bad land transportation was historically, so trying to move stuff over muddy roads historically was not something that you would do. I mean, you would only try to put up with it when you had no choice, like for example, when your army was marching. Other than that, yeah, you could move goods over land, but it would be so expensive because moving things on dirt roads is, your wagon will break, you will lose some of your stuff along the way. It's extremely slow, so you cannot move perishable goods over long distances. So historically, most things, unless they could be shipped by water, would be produced and consumed locally. But then, obviously, manufacturing industries emerged, and one industry that became really dominant, or at least achieved a significant status symbol, was the car industry. Now, as with every new industry, at first only rich people can afford cars, so they're really luxury items that only really rich people can afford. Poor people would either walk or ride a bicycle. But eventually, as new technologies are developed, as more producers entered that game, as better production technologies were developed, cars became, after a couple of decades, an item of mass consumption. And the first car that was really affordable to a large number of people in advanced economies, or at least in the United States and Canada, was the Ford Model T. So this was the first car really that the middle classes could afford, and almost overnight the car went from being, well, think of a Tesla today. So if you've heard about Tesla, an electric car, price range between $100,000 to $150,000. Okay, so it's a toy for the rich, in my opinion. It's not a product for mass consumption, but it's not a bad way of thinking of what the car industry was like a century ago. I mean, who can afford a Tesla among you? I mean, perhaps some of you come from a rich family and your parents already own one, but assuming that you come from a middle-class background and you want to go out there and buy a car because you need to commute to Scarborough to get your first job, if you only had Teslas on the market, you would find another way to get out there. So the Ford Model T is the first sort of basic model that a lot of people can afford, and it really changes the face of the industry. So up until the Model T came along, you had several car manufacturers. In the United States, you had over 80 of them. In France, 150. In the UK, 40. And that's kind of easy to understand because the first people who produced cars were people who produced either bicycles or else produce horse carriage. And you had a lot of those around. And so the car comes along, and what is it? Well, it's kind of a glorified bicycle, or it's a small horse carriage to which you add an engine. So you can understand why many people would have seen an opportunity there and would have begun manufacturing cars. But fairly quickly, especially after a few successful models like the Model T come along, these people are either bought by their competitors or else go out of business. Okay, so a few videos here. They were working the last time I checked. Oh, come on. No, don't do that. Oh, I don't have time for this. What's my option here?
By the late 1800s, steam power ruled transport, but inventors began looking for alternative, more efficient means of transportation. The result was one of the most pervasive and important inventions in history, an invention that would soon dominate the transportation industry, the automobile. The early automobiles originally used the steam engine as their main source of power, but they were slow, cumbersome, and fairly uncomfortable for the passengers forced to sit close to the steamy hot boiler. The very first automobile is generally credited to 18th century French inventor Nicolas Joseph Cugnot. His vehicle was financed by the French government and was originally designed as a steam-propelled three-wheeled artillery wagon. With a top speed of 2 miles per hour, the vehicle ran out of control during a demonstration and crashed into a wall. But it is 1880s German inventor and automaker Carl Benz who is generally credited as the father of the automobile.
Carl Benz and his contemporary Gottlieb Daimler are important because they're really the first people to not only come up with, in their case, gasoline-powered road vehicles, but they persisted at it and eventually developed vehicles that they sold for market.
One man who perhaps more than any other would revolutionize the automobile industry with his gasoline-powered automobiles was Detroit automaker Henry Ford. Ironically, it was an early steam engine that inspired the automotive pioneer.
The first self-powered vehicle that Henry Ford ever saw as a boy was one of these steam traction engines. For Ford, one of these light bulb moments, he saw this thing coming down the road as a young boy, and it affected him profoundly.
By the early 1900s, numerous companies were beginning to make automobiles, but it was Henry Ford who succeeded in bringing the auto to the public.
The great accomplishment of Ford Motor Company was to take something that was enormously complicated like an automobile and put it on this assembly line method, which required interchanging parts and required all these conveyors and carefully choreographed movement of all these parts and sub-assemblies. Engines and transmissions and rear axles had to be on their own assembly lines before they could all come together for that chassis assembly line.
But it did come together. With the assembly line in full force by the 1920s, the price of the Model T, or Tin Lizzie as it was known, had dropped from $850, a staggering figure for the day, to only $260. By the time the Model T stopped production in 1927, 17 million had rolled off the line.
The automobile is probably the most influential invention of the first half of the 20th century. It had such huge ramifications. It reshapes the landscape. You end up with things like the interstate highway system. It results in not the death, but the decline of the railroads, which were the great 19th century industry.
The enormous popularity of the automobile would forever alter transportation.
The Edsel has, of course, gone down in history as...
Okay, so we're not going to discuss the Edsel here. So a little bit more on the...
Toyota has a long history of making awesome sports cars. The 2000 GT, the Supra.
Back in Detroit, Henry Ford wondered how he could bring the price of the Model T down to where everybody could buy it. He figured that the more cars he made and sold, the cheaper he could sell each one. And he went to work on this idea. In those days, each car was built from the frame up on stationary wooden horses. There was a different crew for each car, and the same crew stayed on the car until it was finished. That meant duplication of effort and a lot of time wasted. So they tried moving the men from car to car. Each man had a special job to do, and as soon as he finished it, he moved on to the next car and did the same thing there. That was better, but it still took 12 and a half hours to assemble each Model T. Henry Ford watched it for a while, then he had an inspiration. Instead of moving the men past the cars, why not move production all over the world. Once they found that the idea would work, they began to improve it, refine it. They rolled the chassis down a single line of track, pushing it from crew to crew. And the more expert they became at this new method, the faster the cars came off the assembly line, and the price of the Model T began to drop. They tried the same idea on all the various parts of the car, and created what were called sub-assemblies. Each man on the line became a specialist. He did one thing, and he did it perfectly, and passed the work along to the next man. Minute by minute, production was winning the battle against wasted time and wasted effort. Parts were fed to the workmen by gravity slides so they wouldn't have to stop and wait for new parts. Then they put the parts on moving conveyor belts. This was a great step forward because now they could regulate the flow of work and keep it moving at a constant rate of speed. And the conveyor belts grew longer and more complex as they moved the work from place to place in the huge shops. They became fantastic masterpieces of planning and engineering. But the battle against wasted time and wasted effort was being won. The cars began coming off the assembly line at the rate of one every 40 seconds. And what Henry Ford had foreseen happened. Mass production and the assembly line drove the price of the Model T down from $850 to $300. Now everybody could have one. Back in Detroit, Henry Ford wondered how he...
Okay, so again, the point here is that you don't get prices down by simply doing more of the same. You get prices down by innovating constantly, by developing new products, but also improving the way you design and build and assemble those products. So mass production, I need to quiz you on something, so please write this down. What are the basic characteristics of mass production? Well, for something like the Ford Model T, for example, you obviously produce a huge volume of things, but especially in the early days of mass production, your range is very limited. And for example, if you wanted a Ford Model T, as Henry Ford used to say, you could have any color you wanted as long as it was black. And the reason why you didn't want to get into that is that paints in those days were not all that great, paint metals were not that great, and they would not necessarily withstand the elements. Besides, it would add costs to his operation. And by the way, one reason why General Motors eventually overtook the Ford Motor Company is that they were willing to introduce things like annual model changes and different colors and stuff like that. But Henry Ford was very innovative when he was a young man, and then he sort of became set in his ways, and General Motors eventually grew bigger than the Ford Company. So limited range, standardized products, and mass market customers. So the Ford Model T was never designed for rich people. Now, Rolls-Royce didn't go out of business, Mercedes-Benz didn't go out of business. Other luxury car producers lasted into the 40s and the 50s, and that's because they were targeting a different market. So mass production really meant producing a lot of stuff for ordinary people, not a few luxury goods for a few wealthy people. Okay, so limited range, standardized products, mass market customers. So characteristics, something else to remember, very large volumes. So how do you bring costs down? Well, you produce more of the stuff and you become better at producing it. In the early days especially, so this was true for Henry Ford, but this was also true of other businesses at the time, be it steel, meat packing, radio manufacturers when radios came along. So massive assembly plants, very rigid methods. So what these types of business do at one point from time to time is that they shut down, they send their employees on vacation, they retool the line, they will introduce new technologies, but for long periods of times they will essentially produce the same thing over and over again. And if you want to improve, then you need to shut down, bring in new machines, bring in new components, whatever. And while the process is working, there's really no change. Now, each assembly workers who worked for Ford was well paid. There's some controversy as to why that was the case. I think the best argument was that this was very boring work. You know, if you spend your day doing the same thing over and over again, especially as I get older and I keep hurting myself playing badminton, doing the same motion, so it hits me a bit more. It's kind of boring, and at some point you're like, okay, I can't do this anymore, I need something more creative. So in order to reduce turnover, especially of people who had mastered a few skills, Henry Ford had to pay his employees more, but he could do that because the more cars he sold, the more profitable he was. So each assembly worker becomes highly specialized at a narrow task, has to work very quickly because obviously you need to churn out as many cars as you can, but endless repetition. You know, if your shift is from 8 to 4 or 12 to 8 or whatever, you basically do 8 hours minus, I don't know, 30 minutes for lunch and maybe 15 minutes break of the same work over and over and over and over again. So the main problems historically was that, yeah, you can always retool things, but the people who think about improvements are engineers or a few people at the top of the industry. You don't really tap into the creativity of all of your workers. And developing a new model is something that is very costly because you need to design new parts, you need to manufacture those new parts, you again need to retool your assembly line. So Ford was not very keen to do that, and this is why he kept churning out black Model Ts for a number of years. So his system was efficient, but it was not very creative, and there were a number of incentives against developing new models. Okay. Now, what will happen, and again, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but because even Ford kept a number of suppliers in Detroit and in the Midwest, so. But anyway, the textbook version of the story is that Ford, General Motors, American producers generally, you still had American Motors for a while, Chrysler, become really enamored of mass production. They will introduce a new model each year, but that's pretty much all they will do. And then the Japanese enter the car market. And at first, they're at a significant disadvantage because obviously space is at a premium in Japan. They don't have the resources to compete heads-on with Henry Ford, so they have to be more creative. And what they develop is what is called lean production. And if I ask you to define lean production, the claim is that it combines the best features of both craft production, where you have a skilled artisan who basically produces a product from scratch, but also the best features of mass production. So it's a system that is more flexible, that relies more on suppliers, in which you still have an assembly line, but the components are produced by people who are outside the main plants, and then they will deliver the stuff to the main plant rather than being manufactured by the same company. And so the claim that was made historically was that through lean production, you were able to reduce cost per unit, but also improve dramatically quality. And at the same time, being much more flexible and providing more challenging and interesting work for your workers. So again, I would need to find you a good short video on that. I couldn't. But the point is that the Japanese will introduce a system that is much less rigid, that will rely on a lot more, that will give a lot more leeway to external suppliers to be creative, and they will develop an assembly system which can be adopted much more easily than the Americans. Now, one component behind that, and that's obviously a minor factor in the overall scheme of things, is that if you ever go to Japan, what do you notice about the way people drive there? Have you ever been there? They drive on the left, they don't drive on the right. What happens when you drive on the left? Your steering wheel is not on the same side as in North American cars. And so what you have to develop, among other things, is an assembly line where you can put the steering wheels on different sides depending on whether or not you're selling your car to Japanese or you're selling it to North Americans. Well, this might not seem like a great deal, but you need a different sets of tools, you need to organize your things differently. And because they had to do that, among other things, the Japanese developed production technologies that were more flexible. Whereas I suspect Henry Ford would never have thought of developing cars that would be driven on the west side of the road. So Ford has a presence in Europe. They might even be selling cars in the UK, but historically, at least in the early days of the car industry, the idea of having a flexible way of producing cars, because you might need to produce cars for different markets, if for no other reason that they might have to drive on different sides of the road, is not something that was in the mind of someone like Henry Ford. And again, that's an oversimplification, but it's just to tell you that sometimes people deal with different circumstances and they have to be more flexible. Okay, another advantage of lean manufacturing, and I'm not going to quiz you on that, is that they were much better at getting feedback from their employees. So the way the system evolved in the United States, and again, I hate oversimplifying, but there is a lot of truth to that, I'm told. You had engineers in R&D in the US who sort of thought about innovation and thought of doing new things. You obviously had people like that in Japan, but they were much better at collecting suggestions from their employees on the shop floor, might come up with neat little inexpensive ways to do things better. Whereas if you work in a conventional mass production factory, you do what you're told, and your input is neither sought nor required. Okay, supplier relationship, I won't quiz you on that, but when Ford emerged in Detroit, he was relying on a lot of local suppliers. It did not appear out of nowhere. There was already a car industry in Detroit. He just took it to the next level. But he liked the idea of being self-sufficient. And for example, the first Ford Model Ts were made out of wood. Again, remember what I told you about horse carriages? The first Ford Model Ts, the structure was, you might have components made out of metal, but the box of the car was made out of wood. So what do you do if you're Henry Ford? Well, among other things, you buy forests to own your own lumber. And so you manufacture your own lumber, you bring that to your plant, and there was always this notion of integrating stuff as much as possible within the confines of your operations, whereas the Japanese were always much more comfortable letting a bunch of suppliers compete with each other, and because they have to compete with each other, well, they have to be creative, and each year you can squeeze a bit more value out of them in a way that a self-contained operation will not do. Okay, so again, things have changed since the early days of Ford, so a couple more videos that will bring you to the present.
Manufacturers have long used components made by other companies, their suppliers. But globalization globalization now means manufacturers get more and more of their components outsourced. In other words, they drive costs down by picking and choosing from suppliers all over the world. The company which has its name on a product does less and less of the actual manufacturing. They just put it together. A powerful example of globalized manufacturing is the car industry. This is the Dodge Ram pickup truck, an American favorite, made by US company Chrysler. But its components come from, well, everywhere. This film will follow the amazing chain which makes just one of them. A supply chain is a sequence of companies that transform goods one step at a time, and these days supply chains stretch right across the world. This is Teresa on her way to where she works, a company called Modine Radiator, Clinton, Tennessee. Here they make the radiators for the Dodge Ram. We're going to look at the supply chain for just one component of the radiator, the cap. This is Boniface on the way to where he works. Sundram Fasteners in Chennai, India. Here they make radiator caps which they package for shipment to all over the world, including to Modine in Tennessee, where Teresa assembles them to the radiator. But Teresa and Boniface are just two of many links in the global supply chain. Is what's called a second-tier supplier. They're one link in the chain away from Modine, the first-tier supplier, to Chrysler, who actually make the pickup truck. But there are more tiers going further back. This is Burke Limited in the West Midlands in Britain. Burke is a third-tier supplier. They supply parts for the radiator cap to Sundram, the second-tier supplier.
Sundram have been a customer of ours for about 15 years. We make the springs and parts and washers that go to form the radiator cap.
Brian is the CEO of Burke Limited. He came to the company as general manager in 1976 and bought the company in 1998.
I think we fit about 40% of the world cars on certain types of switches and plates. We supply the majority of the car industries in Europe, several in the United States, but not as a first-tier supplier.
Here, the Burke technician installs the press tool and monitors the quality of a new batch of steel valves bound for Sundram. But this particular supply chain goes further back than Burke Limited. It starts with ThyssenKrupp in Germany, who supply Burke with the rolled steel to make the parts. ThyssenKrupp is therefore a fourth-tier supplier. At the other end of the chain is what's called the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer. In this case, Chrysler, the company that assembles the final product and puts its name on it. The chain that makes the radiator cap is just one of many chains that operate to create the final product. A couple of hours' drive from Burke, in Corsham, is Precision Cut Rubber, or PCR. PCR manufactures rubber washers and seals.
Right, what we've got here is a dispatch area, so if we go through now to the die cutting hall.
This is Stuart. He manages PCR's factory. Like Burke, PCR depends on the car industry for a large share of its business. And like Burke, they're a link in the global car supply chain. They too supply Sundram in India, but they're not always third-tier suppliers. They have different positions in different chains.
We supply directly to Ford, directly to Jaguar and Land Rover, Visteon right through the States, South America, India, the Philippines, and then through most of the major tier companies, right down to small sub-suppliers, second, third tier, into the major OEM. So truly, we dispatch on a global basis. Something like 50% of our turnover is actually exported.
Okay. Okay, something that is not in the textbook, but that I will quiz you on. What were the most significant events in terms of car production in the last few decades? So again, I've already told you that at first you had a number of car manufacturers in the United States, in Japan, in France. France at one point in time had more car manufacturers than the United States. But obviously, Henry Ford comes along, General Motors comes along, Chrysler comes along, the Germans were always there, in France you had Peugeot and Citroën, and for a while things were kind of settled that way, but then at the end of World War II, the Japanese entered the market, so Toyota, Honda, Suzuki. So they went from 1.3% of car production in 1960 to 26%. A quarter of the world's car were manufactured in Japan by the late 1980s. Now they've declined since then. Today it's even lower, but that's partly because they've shipped some production overseas. At first there was a big backlash against Japanese imported cars in the 1980s. So again, today you might say, well, Donald Trump is a protectionist. If you're an economist, that's bad. Well, same protectionist tendencies were really at work in the 1980s as people in Detroit and Michigan and neighboring states began losing market shares to Japanese cars. So partly as a result of that, but also partly because it sort of made sense economically, some Japanese companies began to move some assembly operations to the United States. What has really been significant since the 21st century began, though, is the rise of China. So China now produces a number of cars. They've been the world's most important car producer for a few years, but it's mostly for the domestic market. So I've never been to China. I suspect a few of you have. You're young, but maybe you've seen much change in your life. You've got much more of a middle class in China, and middle classes the world over, except maybe in Denmark, want cars. So Chinese operations have been built to serve the local market. In terms of the geography of trade, so I told you about car producers, what really happened, well, Japan and then China. In terms of the geography of trade in the 1960s, it was dominated by the United States, to a lesser extent by Europe. So if you wanted to see, if you were in a less advanced economies and you wanted to import cars, you would typically go to the United States. Or if you were a colony or a former colony, you might go back to the mother country and import, for example, French cars. Yeah, my parents were Quebec nationalists, so I grew up in Renault with French cars, and I was glad when my parents switched over to Japanese cars, that's all I'll say. But I've driven a few times in France, and I must confess that the quality has improved, and French cars are not that bad today. So, dominated by the US, lesser extent Europe. Again, the rise of Japan in terms of exports in the 1970s and 1980s. Today, car manufacturing is really concentrated in three major global regions. North America, Western Europe, although Eastern Europe has also become significant, and Asia. And so, of course, historically you had Japan, so the Japanese still produce a lot of car, but again, China has really become an important player. Okay? Now, in the rest of the world, you've got a few assembly industries using imported components. So Australia is not a very populous country. It has less than 25 million people, but it's kind of isolated, and at the same time, people are rich. But the way to think about cars, though, is that you're basically exporting empty space. So if you manufacture a car, you put it on a ship, a significant amount of what you transport is empty space, because that's what a car is. It's kind of an empty box so that you can sit in it and put your grocery in the trunk. So in some cases, it makes sense to export some car parts and have them assemble in the final market, because you waste a lot less space that way. Now, it doesn't make sense in many countries where you don't have an industrial base, but in a country like Australia, I should see if they still assemble car, but until fairly recently they did, and the rationale was that it's not because the market was so huge, but it was big enough, the country was industrialized enough to do that, and it made sense to import car parts and put them together in Australia rather than export what was essentially empty space. But as transportation costs have gone down, there was less of an incentive to do that over time. Some Eastern European economies have become more important player. In that case, it's mostly cheap labor close to German operations. So producing cars is expensive in Germany, but you've got a number of countries that open up after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Eastern Europe, and they were close enough to Germany to benefit from the kind of network of German operations, but the cost of assembling cars was a lot less in places like Poland than they were in Germany. And again, the emergence of China. So China has produced mostly for the domestic market, but they've begun exporting too. Okay, makes sense. Not exactly rocket science. Okay, I won't quiz you on that one. So the demand for cars has changed a lot over time. So in the 1970s, you had station wagons, which were kind of, almost a hearse in terms of its design. But then you've had the emergence of SUVs and minivans for suburban families in the last couple of decades. So you've got long-term changes in demand, but these things do take time. But as with any other good, there's increasing market segmentation and fragmentation over time. Now, this being said, if the car industry was something that all countries wanted a few years ago, that's no longer really the case today. That's because the market is really saturated in advanced economies. There's overcapacity the world over. Many people can produce car. It's not because it might seem like an interesting business that it is necessarily a profitable business. And so that's why governments have been targeting things like, consumer electronics or biotechnologies or whatever. There is still fast growth, though, in some parts of the world that are emerging. For example, China, some Latin American countries when they're doing well, but still, it's not a highly lucrative economic sectors. Okay, this is the evolution of the car sector in the last half century. So you can see how much the United States dominated the world car market in the 1950s. So basically the Europeans have been busy destroying each other's car manufacturing operations. But eventually other people emerged. So the Canadians, that's us. So Ontario was the main beneficiary of that. You can see how Japan went from being nothing to being a very significant player. So that's Germany here, Deutschland. France, they produce mostly for their domestic market. The Italians also, and then you had a few assembly operations in places like Spain. And then you can see how insignificant China was and how significant it is today. Korea, South Korea is also another important player. Okay. Another thing that has happened these last couple of decades is that the car sector has become increasingly concentrated. So in any line of work, when profitability margins become thinner, when there is more competition, there is an incentive to consolidate businesses. And so this is not exactly up to date. There have been a few changes, but what has happened is that a number of producers essentially sort of merge with each other to become more competitive. So for example, Chrysler had a lot of links with Germany, less so at the moment, but even Japanese and American producers and Swedish and French producers got into agreements. But the problem, of course, when you merge these operations is that it's often a logistics nightmare. So there are a number of videos on that, but I thought this one was especially interesting.
In today's day and age, where would we be without our car? And when our car is in need of maintenance, we expect repairs to be completed close to home, within a reasonable time and at reasonable costs. Especially when we own a car made by a well-known brand like Ford. It all sounds logical from a car owner's point of view. But did you know that one single car consists of over 7,000 separate parts? And because of the fierce competition between car brands, manufacturers need to launch new or updated models more often than ever before. Models consisting of slightly different spare parts than their predecessors.
Like the Fiesta, the C-Max, the Grand C-Max, the Mondeos, the S-Max, the Galaxy, the Transits.
And all of these models are sold all over Europe, including Eastern Europe, where the number of sold cars grew rapidly the last decade. More cars, as you now know, equals more parts to go around. Due to these developments, the number of different spare parts needed by dealers is increasing every day.
And therefore, we have about 175,000 finish codes or material articles here stored.
Delivering on-the-spot service, a massive growth of different spare parts being in circulation, and prices constantly under pressure. To Ford, these were 3 good reasons to look for ways to optimize their spare parts supply chain, keeping sustainability and ecological values in the back of their minds. But this counts only for 20% of this logistics puzzle. At the beginning of the new millennium, Ford had simultaneously added Mazda, Land Rover, Volvo, and Jaguar to its portfolio. All of these brands came with their own supply chain for inbound and outbound shipments, totally different from the existing network.
We had several systems per brand of Mazda, Jaguar, Land Rover, Volvo cars with all different service level requirements for the customers and the dealers. All material flows have not been synchronized and harmonized, and it was really a huge volume of data we had to sort out.
Some figures. There were the 175,000 different types of spare parts collected from 2,450 different suppliers. And all these parts had to be delivered at 2,900 dealers across Europe by 750,000 shipments each year, costing 200 million euros. The challenge for the Ford Customer Service Division: make a robust and cost-efficient logistics network, integrating the networks of the other brands into their supply chain, and at the same time, improve the quality of service for dealers and consumers. The Network Integrator was born.
We brought an innovative idea into life. The concept is easy to design to combine different material flows. The difficulty is in the detail to make that all happen, that all the participating companies with their service levels and their commitments to their customers are fully supported.
The targets of the Network Integrator team were ambitious. Within 10 years, the team had to achieve an on-time delivery performance of 98%, a 15% more efficient use of the supply chain network measured by CO2 reduction and transport volume cost reduction. Combined combined transport sourcing, leading to a cost reduction per market tender of 15%. This is where Penske Logistics stepped in. Penske is a leading logistics service provider dedicated to making supply chains work in the best possible way to optimally support the business of their customers. Not only the automotive industry, but in various types of organizations, no matter how complex the supply chain. The challenge Ford was facing and the expertise Ford and Penske could both bring to the table were a perfect match. Successful cooperation was the key to achieving a collaborative logistics solution.
We are quite happy to have them on board. And it's really a perfect match, their experience and our experience from the customer and the material flow side.
Our part is obviously that we have the distribution network in Europe with the 9 parts distribution center, the 22 markets, and our obligation to send on time to our customers spare parts in the right quality. Penske's role in that was to help us professionally to design that network. As a professional logistics provider, they brought a lot of expertise into that to design it right and to optimize it right.
What were the steps the network integrator team took? First of all, Ford analyzed the European map of the parts distribution centers. There were 3 source locations and 5 local distribution centers delivering to 18 brake bulk centers. And from these centers, all European dealers were supplied. After that, the delivery service levels were defined: the daily stock order, the weekly stock order, and the urgent order for next day delivery. The next step was to collect all data from all the brands. A thorough analysis showed many possibilities for synergies and improvement.
Penske has these tools like center of gravity tools to identify where are the best cross-dock locations in the inbound and outbound network. We have experience of a carrier database where we have the Ford shipments live in our system so that we have the right data set available for the logistics engineering.
Now, Ford was ready for the final step, the design of a joint logistics network across brands and integrating those into a joint tender that would enable the synergy effects of the individual supply chains while finding the best solution for a certain region. The network integrator team call these market tests.
A market test is in the network integrator terminology, a transport tender or request for quote. We are tendering the outbound and inward logistics flow on the market for a specific country or geographic area.
One of the most important elements of these market tests is flexible sourcing, using multiple logistics scenarios for one geographical area.
That means in specific, where is the optimal cross-dock location? Should we move cargo from Cologne to the East European countries via a cross-dock center in Prague or in Budapest? So these different scenarios we design in order to be more cost-effective and also to improve the service to the dealers so that the spare parts getting in time and fast to the end customers of Ford.
The results of these market tests were integrated in the ongoing process. By repeating these tests, the network integrator became a highly effective and continuously self-improving system.
The market tests are successful because we are running them for 10 years now. After every market test, it has been some improvements in place so that we come up to now to a high efficient process.
But more important, the network integrator proved that it was beneficial not only for Ford, but for all parties involved.
I think one of the things with the network integrator concept is it's evolved into a best-in-class solution, which is now a platform where other automotive brands can come on board for various regions where it makes sense. It's a scalable solution that can be successful for all parties involved.
Now, 10 years after the introduction of the network integrator, the results are stunning. Even though Volvo, Jaguar, Mazda, and Land Rover are no longer owned by the Ford Motor Company, some still choose to take part in certain market tests of the network integrator team. The project proved to be a solid concept, even in times of recession. The results exceeded the expectations.
In the financial metrics, to use economy of scale, we reduced in the last 4 years more than 20% our transportation cost. At the same time, we improved the service level to our customers with on-time delivery, as well as that we had also our participation on carbon footprint, because we are reducing about 10,000 tons CO2 emission every year, which translates to about 25 million tons kilometer transportation avoidance while optimizing the network.
Collaboration contributes greatly to this success. The professionals of Ford and Penske work side by side in a network integrator team. The team itself works closely with suppliers, dealers, brands, and other service providers.
I think the key things that are important with this are partnership and collaboration. There has to be transparency amongst the various partners dealing with each other, whether it be the automotive brands or us as a provider, and really the collaboration aspect and working together for a common goal.
Based on the success of the past 10 years, the Network Integrator team is now ready to bring the concept to the next level, inviting other brands, and maybe even take it beyond the automotive industry.
I would make the statement that it is not even restricted to automotive business. There could be also white and brown goods transported at the same truck going to a destination if the destination, the service level matches basically the network.
The benefits really become from a scale standpoint and leveraging volumes and looking at footprints and flows within the different regions so that there can be looking at really reducing the overall transportation footprint for logistics within Europe.
The Network Integrator concept, it reduced Ford's logistics costs while at the same time avoiding 25 million driven kilometers each and every year. And the customer, for whom it all started in the first place? The car is serviced on time at reasonable costs at their local dealer around the corner.
Okay, so a couple of points here. Again, innovation, doing more with less. You can have your economic cake and your environmental cake at the same time. And remember what I told you about innovation, combining existing things in new ways or finding new application for what you have. Again, this is a specific case, but these patterns have long been extremely common. Because that's how the human brain works, and that's how market economies work. Okay. Almost done with the car. So cars are not really popular anymore in advanced economies, at least according to polls, but there's always a discrepancy between what people say to pollsters and the convenience that is provided by a car. So what you see in less advanced economies is that as soon as they can, people give up on bicycles, scooters, and public transportation, and you've got scenes like this one in Beijing, for example. Now, this being said, there are a few parts of the world where the culture really has turned against the car. So if you have a desk job in a large city in a place like Denmark, well, then of course you can move around on your bicycle. So as long as you're not expected to visit a lot of customers or to deliver stuff. Copenhagen at rush hour is a place where I can say from experience, if you're one of the few car drivers and you don't really know what you're doing, you don't get a lot of respect from cyclists because they occupy the road and they really let you know that you're the one who don't belong there. Okay, location trends in rich market economies. Historically, manufacturing was concentrated in cities, so especially in the age of railroad and the steam engine, manufacturing plants would be built downtown. You would have trains delivering them stuff, and because the steam engine was not very flexible, factories were often tall buildings with several layers to them. But then with the advent of trucking and highways, manufacturing relocated to suburbia where you would have more land and typically only one floor where all the manufacturing activities would take place. Now, there are some cities that lost their manufacturing base over time, other parts of the world that have gained a lot of industries. So one fast-growing industrial region in the world these last few decades has been southern China, so the Pearl River Delta, just north of Hong Kong. So basically what happened is that the economy developed in Hong Kong, everybody was cramped, manufacturers needed more place, they needed more labor. China opened up, and Hong Kong entrepreneurs paved the way to other businesses eventually relocating in southern China. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on that. So what branch of economic geography does is to try to extract first principles from the locational behavior of firms and individuals. And so the standard approach to that is an economic one, meaning that you assume that factories are rational, or at least factory managers are rational. They try to minimize costs. They face various constraints. Where are the raw materials coming from? Where are the manufactured parts coming from? Where are the customers? And so in terms of factory location, well, each of these components sort of pull the industry in a certain direction, but eventually, depending on what the industry is, depending on how significant the market is versus the cost of moving inputs, it makes sense to find one location in geographical space. And so, some economic geographers like to draw lines and circles and make, play little abstract exercises. One of my professors was one of the foremost Weberian. That's not Max Weber for the sociologist here, that's Alfred Weber, who was his brother. So the sociologist Weber is better known than his geographer brother. But when we talk about the Weberian, in my field, we're talking about Alfred, not Max. So I've had a number of professors and colleagues who like to draw circles or do geometric tricks. That's not really me. That's not really also what the authors of the textbook are into, so I'm not going to quiz you on that. But as the authors point out, beyond the strictly rational considerations that you have in this kind of approach, a lot of businesses are located where the business founder was born. I mean, Microsoft, for example, is in Seattle, not because of the nice weather, but that's where Bill Gates and some of the co-founders were born. So they first located to New Mexico and eventually moved back to Seattle. There was enough of a cluster there. They were close enough to Silicon Valley in California. But if Bill Gates had been born in, let's say, Portland, Oregon, well, Microsoft would be located in Portland, not Seattle. Now, as firms become larger, multinational corporations have an embarrassment of riches in terms of where they can locate production. Well, let me qualify that. If there's a lot of know-how required to manufacture something, and only a few locations the world over offer you the kind of skilled labor that is required to do that, then obviously you might be restricted to a few locations. But if it is final assembly, for example, and all you need are people who are willing to work long hours for not too much money, then obviously you can play one location against another. So you might say, well, isn't that terrible that firms are doing that? Well, yes and no. You need to keep in mind that consumers don't want to pay more than they have to. So again, trade-off, supply and demand. So institutional typology of location condition. Make a note for table 11.3. There might be a question based on a few of these factors here on the tangible and intangible features of consumers or transportation or energy and utilities. These are all factors that play a role in terms of business location. Location and the product cycle model. Again, there's such a thing as a product life cycle. So the Ford Model T sort of took slowly, then the demand picked up. That's where Ford and his engineers found ways to reduce production costs. And then the demand really peaked. Then it sort of plateaued, and then it crashed as General Motors came up with a more interesting product to consumers. So obviously, this created a mini crisis within the Ford Motor Company at the time. But the same is true for any products. They tend to follow a logistic curve. And so manufacturing facilities have to adapt to that. Branch plant and local developments. So the easiest way, if you're a politician, to promote local development is to go out and advertise to large business, to say that, well, my location is the best, we've got a deep water port, the cheapest electricity rates in North America, our labor costs are reasonable, our people don't go on strike too often, and we're close enough to markets, that it kind of makes sense to attract a certain type of operation in a certain type of location. And some parts of Canada were very good to do that historically with, let's say, pulp and paper mills in certain locations. The problem is that there's very little in terms of local economic development beyond a branch plant relocating to your local economy. They typically have already their suppliers network. They won't buy much locally. They might extract a resource in your locality, pay high wages. But once the product life cycle of whatever it is that they produce, let's say newsprint, so paper that was produced for newspapers, kind of goes to hell in a handbasket, then obviously you have a problem, and the big plant closes and there isn't much left in your local economy. So cultivating entrepreneurs is typically a more sustainable path in the long run, but it's much more difficult to do than just invite a large firm that will hire a lot of semi-qualified people and pay them good money. Now, obviously, every manufacturing operation has to adjust over time. Sometimes the shutdown can last a few weeks, sometimes it might be more shorter, a few days. It obviously depends on the type of work that you are into. Supplier coordination, you had a sense of that in the video one of the videos that I showed you. Logistics industry is a lot more complex than people realize, and coordinating thousands of suppliers is no easy task. So I think people in the logistic industry should be given more respect than they often are. The make or buy decision, so you understand a bit better now, if you didn't already, that from the perspective of a business, the decision is never limited to should I make or not make a product, but it's always should I make or buy a product if you decide to make one. So do you keep the production in-house? Will you outsource it to suppliers? If so, will you also outsource it to multiple suppliers? Will you be looking for people who are far from your operations if they're cheaper? Do you want to keep them close at hand in order to develop a better relationship? If you're willing to go beyond what you know, how do you locate suppliers? So again, there's a lot of know-how and efforts associated with that. If you want to find a Chinese manufacturer, you can do worse than attend the Canton Fair, where you can meet thousands of firms who manufacture all sorts of things. From value chains to value cycles. Recycling, reusing resources. It's pretty much what it is about. It's not always pretty. E-waste and recycling in China. So none of us would like to do these kinds of jobs, but again, the issue is, it's like, child labor. Is this the best option that these people have, and will you really help them if you sort of take that business away from them? These things are never easy. Geography of value cycle trends. Okay, a few more slides and I'll let you go. Manufacturing on clustering and congregation. So I've told you before about Silicon Valley. So that's the region south of San Francisco here. So I showed you a video of the Traitorous 8, which are kind of the mythical founding figures of Silicon Valley, even though there had been electronics manufacturers around San Francisco for many decades before that. So some company that you know and might appreciate or not, so YouTube, Facebook, Yahoo, Google, Intel, Hewlett-Packard, they're all based south of San Francisco in the Santa Clara Valley, which is known now as Silicon Valley. This is what Silicon Valley looked like in the 1980s. It was still mostly a manufacturing-based economy at the time. Software was important, but not to the extent that it is today. So a lot of semiconductor manufacturing was still being done in Silicon Valley. But then as these processes became standardized, as the demand for those products picked up, the region was no longer competitive. So a number of these operations relocated to places like Malaysia, for example. But Silicon Valley didn't die because it had a network of entrepreneurs, it had a concentration of smart people. People found new things to do and new industries to create. Now this is what it looked in the 1990s. So you had at the time less semiconductors, still a little bit of manufacturing, but software was slowly coming along. And you had a number of firms that had open listening posts there. So Xerox originally started across the lake from here in Rochester. They eventually moved their headquarters to New York City, but in order to keep up with what was going on in that industry, you had to be in Silicon Valley. So they opened a listening post there, research facilities. Sony, Fujitsu, and a number of others did. So new fancy products came along. Some of them were manufactured in Silicon Valley, but increasingly over time, Silicon Valley came to look like what it does today. And it's mostly software, it's app development, there's very little manufacturing going on anymore. But the point is that what happened in Silicon Valley is not what will happen in a northern Ontario town when your pulp and paper mill closes down. You have an ecosystem of smart people. It's part of the tradition there to launch your own business, and if you fail, nobody holds that against you. So it's a system that has the capacity to constantly reinvent itself and create new industries. So again, Facebook did not exist in the 1990s. A number of other prominent app developers did not exist at the time, but then, Uber was invented there and a bunch of other things. And so who knows what the next thing will be, but being in Silicon Valley makes a lot of sense because you have a lot of smart people who are at the cutting edge of knowledge in your industry. And if you want to be competitive, or if you want a good job, if you're somebody who's really good at, let's say, software engineering, you want to be in Silicon Valley because that's where the action is. Toyota City in Japan, so I've mentioned Toyota before. In a way, they have their own little Silicon Valley, even though it's around one business. The Toyota company originally was in textile equipment manufacturing. They eventually branched into car manufacturing. You can see that Toyota City is actually close to Nagoya, which is a small industrial town roughly halfway between Tokyo and Osaka, further to the south here, which are the two big industrial cities in Japan. So Toyota at first was viewed as a company of country bumpkins by other Japanese, but eventually in time, of course, they became the world's largest car manufacturers. But what they brought again was the strength of an ecosystem of many suppliers competing against each other and innovating on a scale that their American competitors couldn't match for a while. So they have their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers very close to them, but obviously Toyota has become much more globalized over time. Okay, so can clustering be planned? So already in the 1960s, you had people in France who were trying to replicate what was happening in Silicon Valley in California. You had growth poles that were created, so government threw a lot of money at people like Michael Porter of Harvard. I'll bitch about him like I do every time I talk about him. So Porter is a professor of management who sort of discovered economic geography in the late 1980s and went on, made millions of dollars telling policymakers what you learn for not much money in a second-year economic geography course. But what can I say? He's a management professor from Harvard. You had no economic geographers at Harvard, so he was able to sell his model. A lot of people, a lot of politicians are in the business of doing something, and a cluster, which is Porter's strategy is something, so something must be done, this is something, therefore it must be done. But in practice, creating something spontaneous like Silicon Valley is extremely difficult. You've had maybe one or two areas that have sort of succeeded, but you've had thousands of failures. It's ultimately it's people who are on the ground, people who see the real business opportunities, who will create products that will meet consumers' demand. Government can shovel a lot of money to a lot of people, but if you're not really in the business, do you really know who should be favored? And often what happens when you get politicians involved, well, they want their friends or people in their districts to receive the money, and so the incentive to really select winners are not really the same. But then you've got Michael Porter who makes millions of dollars consulting. Okay, so conclusion, many factors affect the location and profitability of manufacturing activities, and global value chains are increasingly complex and increasingly influenced by environmental considerations. I'll try to speed through services and logistics next week. So I still need to hear about some of you regarding your term paper, but I suspect these are not the people who show up here. So I'll be having office hours if you want to talk to me. So see you next week. Just a well, you can mention that.